How do we keep feeding a growing population while reversing climate change and regenerating life on Earth? Finding answers to this question is the very reason why I decided to start this podcast. And to do so, I'll be talking to farmers, experts, and innovators in search for solutions. I am your host, Raphael, and this is the Deep Seed Podcast. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Natallia Gulbis, an expert in the field of soil science with a particular focus on mycorrhizal fungi and their critical role in soil fertility. Hi, Natalia. Thank you for joining me today.
Hello.
Before we get into the depth of the fascinating topic of soil life, could you maybe just introduce yourself, but without talking about your professional life just yet?
Okay, so I live in England and I do have 2 children and husband, but I was born in Belarus on the edge of a primeval forest, Belovezhskaya Pushcha. And because I was born near forest, I had this very unique opportunity to connect with nature. My parents were taking me there to pick mushrooms and berries, and I was also interested a lot in the herbal plants. So imagine as a little child, I was studying different books to see which plants could be used, for example, to make your hair better and skin, or that you can make a tea so you can treat any cold. And I was collecting those plants and preserving them. So that's probably where my interest started. And that's why it wasn't a surprise for anyone else when I decided to become a plant doctor, if you want. Mm-hmm. So I went to the university and I studied crop science and soil sciences and specializing in diseases, weeds, and pest protection. After I finished university, I met my husband and I relocated to England, and that's why I'm here now.
For more than 300 years, but only in the last few years have we started to truly understand how essential they are to all life on Earth. First of all, they're everywhere. So wherever you're listening to this podcast right now, if you look around, anywhere you can look, there's millions of microbes, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Including on yourself, on inside and out. And as a matter of fact, I read that there's more microbes in the human body than there are human cells. Is that right?
Yeah, I've read exactly the same statement, and it's quite difficult to believe that, but that is true. And microbes are found everywhere, from deep ocean to the top of high mountains.
And they play really essential functions in ecosystems, but also inside of the body. So is it fair to say that we cannot exist without microbes?
Yes, that's very fair to say, and on different levels as well. For example, we do also have a symbiotic relationship with microbes. We do have microbes in our guts. They help to absorb nutrients. And if you, for example, best example, if you have antibiotics prescribed to kill bacteria, harmful bacteria, which is great, but it's also killing bacteria that is not harmful, that is beneficial for us. And therefore, is a good way to reestablish your microbial environment, to have some probiotics after you had your medicine. So that's why it is important to understand how beneficial for us. But also another role that we can't exist without microbes. They play a vital role in ecosystem. So they, again, at a high level, they cycle nutrients and contribute to soil fertility, for example, and to general human health.
Yeah, you mentioned their importance in ecosystems, and that's what I want to focus on in this discussion. I want to talk more specifically about soil microbes. My understanding is that there's this complex symbiosis between plants and microbes. I'm reading a book right now by someone called David Montgomery and his wife Anne Biclet. It's called The Hidden Half of Nature, and the title refers to the idea that there's the visible half of nature above ground, so that's plants, animals, and humans. But there's also the underground, invisible half of nature, and that's the two halves are equally important, and they work in complete symbiosis together, and they need each other to thrive. So if one of them suffers, the other one will suffer as well. And if one of them thrives, the other one is bound to thrive as well. Can you maybe describe where this symbiosis comes from and how it actually works?
Yes, you're absolutely right. As you already described what symbiosis is. So it's a relationship between two or more partners, and they all benefit from this relationship. And if I want to give you a probably easiest symbiosis to understand, especially among farmers, is a relationship between nitrogen-fixing bacteria, for example, and legume plants. And we all know if you grow a legume plants, they will make this association where those bacteria inside the fruits will be fixing nitrogen in the air, and we know that there are 78% of nitrogen consist, but is not available to the plant. So that's why this symbiosis happened. So plants can deploy this bacteria, and this bacteria will give them fixed nitrogen, but in return, plants will give protection from outside environment for this bacteria because it lives inside of nodules, and also will be feeding this bacteria because they both benefit from this relationship.
Right. So if I understand correctly, the plant, it needs this nitrogen, this atmospheric nitrogen. You said 98% of...
78%.
78%, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
of the atmosphere is nitrogen. And nitrogen is one of the key macronutrients for plants to grow, right? And so these bacteria have the power to...
Yes, they have special enzymes. And those enzymes, they can fix nitrogen. They can react with nitrogen in atmosphere, which is in a molecule, like, and two nitrogens together. And this nitrogen is not available for plants or for humans, but is available for bacteria because it contains enzyme called nitrogenase, and those enzyme needs to be protected from the oxygen, and that's why those bacteria lives inside the fruits.
So this bacteria, they live inside of the roots of the plant, and they capture this nitrogen and make it available for the plant to grow.
Yes.
And in return, the plant is protecting the bacteria and is feeding it what it needs to
That's
thrive.
absolutely right. But this symbiosis happens only with legume plants. So not plants can have this particular symbiosis. So that's why some farmers prefer to grow legumes plants, because they know they will enrich soil with nitrogen because of this relationship.
And are other types of plants that are not legumes still able to attract bacteria that can transform this atmospheric nitrogen into something usable by the plant?
Yes, exactly. That's absolutely right. I just gave you an example of symbiosis where bacteria, nitrogen-fixing bacteria and plants, they live together. And this is obligate symbiosis. So this bacteria can only live inside of nodules of legume plants. But there are another type where bacteria is a free-living bacteria. They can also fix nitrogen from the air, maybe not that efficiently as rhizobia, but they still can fix some nitrogen, and they can live inside the fruits, depending on type of bacteria, or outside the fruits. And plants, they communicate. They will try to attract this bacteria because they are interested in benefits that it brings.
You're an expert in something called mycorrhizal fungi. Could you tell us what mycorrhizal fungi is and the role it plays within the soil ecosystem?
Okay, mycorrhizal fungi is a beneficial fungi. They make a symbiosis with plants, and there are several types of mycorrhizae. So if I explain from the very, very high level, so there are 4 different types, and probably the one that most people are familiar, symbiosis called ectomycorrhizal fungi. An example, when you go to a forest to pick mushrooms are fruits in bodies of mycorrhizal fungi. And if you do like pick mushrooms, you will notice that some certain mushrooms grow under certain trees because they form symbiosis with those trees. It's quite host specific. So those ectomycorrhizal fungi, mycelium, is inside of soil, finding roots, and just wrap outside the fruits, and that's why you call them ectomycorrhizal fungi. And plant benefits because ectomycorrhiza will get nutrients and water, and in return will give away photosynthetic carbon. But there are other fungi that they mostly spread, and they colonized most plants, 80% of all plants, including arable crops and horticultural crops, those fungi called Arbuscular mycorrhizae fungi. And those fungi, sometimes people call them endomycorrhizae fungi, because endo means inside. Because those fungi, they go inside of plant roots. They form their different structures. For example, they call structures called vesicles. And vesicles, they look like balloons structures when you look on the microscope at them. And is a site of genetic material, so genetic knowledge there. There are other type of structures called arbuscules, and arbuscules, if you look at those structures under the microscope, they look like a tree, and that's a site of exchange. That's where fungi will give away nutrients and water, but in return from the plant, they take away carbon, photosynthesized carbon. I always try to give an example for people to imagine how it looks like. For example, if you imagine our lungs, so that's where a site of exchange. That's where we give away carbon dioxide, but we get in our oxygen. That's a similar site of exchange between
like
fungus.
the lungs. All right.
Yes.
Yeah. And so just try and recap and try and make sure that I understand everything. So we have this specific type of fungi that's called Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. It's quite a complex term. It's very obvious for you because you use it every day, I'm guessing. But I just want to make sure that people listening and hear about this for the first time follow us. And you said that it has a symbiosis with 80% of plants that we grow.
Yeah, terrestrial plants, yes.
And those plants depend on those type of fungi for getting the nutrient and water that they need. Right?
That's what nature designed.
And so they have this kind of exchange place, like a marketplace, where this exchange happens between, from the fungi side, water and micronutrients the plant needs, and then the plant sends back, you said carbon, right?
Yes.
And the fungi needs the sugar, the plant, the carbon to grow.
Yes, exactly, because this type of symbiosis is obligate symbiosis. Obligate means it can't exist, or it can't live, can be alive without host plant. For example, if you have a plant growing without mycorrhizae, without Arbuscular mycorrhizae fungi, it's fine, it will grow, probably won't be that much happy because it will struggle. I will explain later for why it will struggle. But for mycorrhizae fungi, in order to grow, you have to have a host plant. They can't live without host plant. They only alive and only thrive when host plant is there. For example, during my research at university, I studied mycorrhizae fungi in vitro. It means like in sterile conditions. If you study bacteria, usually you grow just bacteria, and that's fine. In my experiments, I had to have two organisms, mycorrhizae fungi and roots.
Plants. And the roots.
Plants or transformed roots in my case. Okay. Because you can't grow fungi without, you can't get away. That was very difficult because you have to have host.
And what happens to a plant if we have less mycorrhizal fungi present in the soil around the root, or if we completely get rid of it? Can a plant still thrive without this type of fungi?
It will struggle unless you supply all nutrients and protect them, because mycorrhizae fungi are known for supply of phosphorus. And phosphorus is an element that present in soil in abundance in most cases, but is not accessible for the plants. So basically, you can have soil rich with phosphorus, but then you can have phosphorus deficiency in plants. And that happens when you don't have those mycorrhizae fungi that will be foraging for these nutrients. And there is a research published saying if plants make this symbiosis with mycorrhizae fungi, they stop uptaking phosphorus themselves completely and just 100% rely on mycorrhizae fungi. Because mycorrhizae fungi can access those phosphorus that is locked, take them into hyphae, and hyphae, they like a network in soil, and they will be looking for those nutrients. And inside of hyphae, they will be delivering inside of roots to those sites of exchange, arbuscules, and will give away. Those mycorrhizae fungi will be taking nitrogen and also they can take nitrogen in different forms. For example, plants, they prefer either nitrate or ammonia, but mycorrhizal fungi can take as amino acids, so it's a higher level, and also deliver to the plant. And some other micronutrients like zinc, they will be delivering. So if you don't have this partnership, plants don't have access to fertilizers, to those nutrients. And then, well, you need, I'm just saying it ahead, you need fertilizers. But the problem with fertilizers, as soon as you add those phosphorus fertilizers, they become locked in soil. And you have to add more and more and more. And basically, you're enriching your soil with phosphorus, but plants still suffering because they don't have those relationships.
What do you mean by locked in soil, and what's stopping the plant from absorbing this nutrients?
Because phosphorus is locked with metals and is very strong bond, chemical bond, and plants don't have those enzymes, don't have those mechanisms that can take phosphorus. There is some free phosphorus, form that is accessible to plants, but it will be quickly getting an amount of those forms will be lower and lower, and then plants will be struggling to take those phosphorus.
Okay.
But fungi, they have those special enzymes, they have special mechanisms that can break those bonds and take in the phosphorus and convert in a form that is accessible or that will be usable by plants.
I see. So this type of fungi has hyphae. Hyphae are these like really thin kind of hair, like microscopic hairs that go everywhere in the soil and that go and find the nutrients.
Yes, they can sense them.
They can get those nutrients much further away from the roots and from the plant. And you can extend kind of the network and the places where it comes and gets these nutrients. And then it's able to transform them with special enzymes into a form that is accessible by the plant. Right? So it's like it's playing this really crucial role that allows the plant to thrive.
Yeah, well, they have those enzymes to break the bond with metals, but inside the fruit, they also transfer them in accessible form for the plants. But you're absolutely right. They do increase absorbent area, and sometimes people call it as a secondary root system. And they can increase by 700 folds.
700 folds?
Yeah.
You mean the root capacity?
Absorbent area. So they basically become an extension of roots.
700 times. So it means that the root on its own has access to nutrients close to where the roots are, the root hairs are.
Yeah.
But by associating with this type of fungi, it can grow its capacity of reaching other nutrients by 700 times. That sounds incredible.
It is incredible because obviously around roots area become depleted of nutrients fairly quickly. But mycorrhizal fungi, they can tailor where to search for nutrients. And if they find a high amount of nutrients in one area, they will expand their network in this area, absorbing. Because in a way, those nutrients this is what they're trading with plants for their carbon. So they need to find those nutrients. And hyphae are very, very thin. They can go into tiniest pores to find those nutrients, and not just nutrients, water as well. So they can deliver water for the plants. So when you have drought conditions, for example, plants is less suffering from this event, because just the best way to think, if plant dies, mycorrhizal fungi die. So they will do everything to make sure plant is alive and doing very well, because if plant is thriving, it means it's synthesizing carbon and it's feeding those carbon back to hyphae.
It's like the plant's best friend. It's just working super hard to bring it all the nutrients it needs because it depends on it.
Yes.
So listening to you, I have this kind of vision, this metaphor, and maybe you'll tell me if I'm completely wrong, but I kind of visualize a city. Like a city needs water, electricity, it needs fuel, it needs all of these things to survive, right?
Yeah.
And it has all of these electrical cables, these tubes in the ground for the water. It has all of these entry points. But a city needs obviously to bring in with roads and trucks and cables from outside of the city all of these resources it needs to survive. And I imagine that this mycorrhizal fungi is like all of these accesses from all of these other places that bring in the electricity and the water and the food and everything that the city needs to survive. But if you cut all of these accesses, the city doesn't have much to go on and cannot survive for very long. Is that kind of a picture that makes sense?
Yeah, you could probably say like that. Yes. I wouldn't say it can't survive, but it will struggle a lot. And probably in extreme events, definitely won't be able to survive. Yes.
Right, okay. What's your favorite interesting fact about mycorrhizal fungi?
There are lots of interesting facts about mycorrhizal fungi, but the one which is mind-blowing, at least for me, is if you take 10 centimeters of soil and all soil that in earth,
All soil on Earth, all the top 10 centimeters of soil.
10 centimeters, and if you extract all hyphae,
Right.
and then just make them line them in one line, do you know how long it's going to be, how long it's going to be?
Right. I actually read something about this, and I seem to remember that it said that you could go halfway across the galaxy with the length of
Yes.
all of... Is that right?
Is that right? Yes.
Okay.
Half, not length, width, half the width of
The width
galaxy.
of the galaxy, yeah.
But it's still mind-blowing, is 450 quadrillions.
Wow.
And if you look what a quadrillion is, it's 15 zeros.
Those kind of numbers are so huge that I feel like it's almost hard to visualize. But I also read something simple like in 1 teaspoon of healthy soil, you could have kilometers of hyphae.
Yes.
So it's hard to imagine just 1 small teaspoon. We're talking about kilometers of hyphae. Yeah, that's quite amazing.
Because mycorrhizal fungi, they are everywhere. If you go in my garden and you dig, they will be there. It's guaranteed. Maybe not the same story with arbol, especially when you have intensive farming. I can't guarantee mycorrhizal fungi will be there, but anywhere in nature, because that's what nature designed for the plant to uptake their phosphorus and become protected from pests and diseases as well.
In the previous episodes of this podcast, I spoke to farmers about regenerative agriculture, and the core idea is that conventional industrial agriculture has been damaging the soils very heavily for decades. But these regenerative farmers are implementing different farming practices that are doing just the opposite, so regenerating soil life and the natural fertility. There are certain specific practices that they all seem to agree have a negative impact on the soil, and others that have a positive one. So what I'd like to do is go through each of these practices with you, the good and the bad, and ask you to explain what's happening there on a microbiological level.
Okay.
The number one thing I keep hearing about is tilling. Could you maybe first explain what tilling is and why most farmers around the world use this practice? And then maybe tell us what happens to the soil and the biology in the soil when the soil is tilled.
So tilling is a practice that involves mechanical distortion of soil, and probably the most extreme event is plowing, when you turn soil upside down. But basically, farmers use this to stop, to prevent cycles of disease cycle or pest cycles, and improve soil aeration, and maybe incorporate some amendments. So there are some positives, but if you do it often and religiously, that will definitely have negative impact, not just on soil bacteria, on soil fungi, but also on soil structure in general. And why is negative for microbes? Imagine your house turned upside down. Would you like it? You wouldn't like this. But same for bacteria and fungi, especially for fungi, because fungi, they form those networks where they connect to different plants, and when you till, you will break this network basically. And if in the worst case scenario, if you don't have a crop growing, so you tilled or you plowed and then you didn't plant anything, you left fallow, that's the worst case scenario for fungi, because you broke all the structure, you didn't put your host back. So fungi, they become vulnerable to deterioration. Some insects probably will eat them, but when we have so rainfall events, they will be deteriorating as well. Some spores will survive, but population will be declining rapidly.
So just a minute ago, we discussed how amazing mycorrhizal fungi is and how important it is to help the plants. And now I'm hearing that this practice that most farmers around the world do, plowing or tilling, and that is actually destroying all of these hyphae and all of these networks that is being built by the mycorrhizal fungi. So if it's so bad, why are we doing it?
because there are other benefits, and sometimes you have soil you have to plow, otherwise it won't be productive. And what farmers want they want to have a productive crop. And if they don't plow, they know, if, for example, if soil is really badly compacted, roots wouldn't grow. You can have help from mycorrhizal fungi, but if initially your soil is like a rock, that's going to be a big struggle. You can have help from mycorrhizae, plant will probably grow, but it won't produce enough yield for the farmer to be interested in growing such way.
Okay, so we have a problem with the soil already, and it's compacted, and it's really
as
hard
an
for roots
example.
to grow. And so we have to use tilling to kind of loosen it up and to allow for the plants and the roots to grow. But by doing that, we're also harming soil health. So we're kind of helping in the short term, but damaging the soil for its fertility in the long term.
That's why farmers need to think about other ways how to improve their soil. So how to reduce compaction, how to enrich soil organic matter, for example. They can employ growing like cover crops, for example. So certain cover crops, they have strong and long roots, so can break those soils, for example. And maybe they can think about compost to enrich their organic matter and soil become more fertile. So it's not like overnight process. When you decided, okay, I will do good for my soil, I stop tilling completely and I will be fine. It's a long time planning process, how you're going to do it, and you have to do it gradually. But what is the most important, you have to be mentally ready, mindset ready, because it doesn't happen overnight. So you have to think how you're going to do it and which steps you're going to take. And probably farmers, you talk that already, the so-called regenerative farmers, they can share their experience, and I'm sure they wouldn't tell you, okay, today I decided to go to regenerative farming, I stopped plowing, and I'm fine. It's not like this. It's gradual process. So especially if your soil is badly damaged, you have to start healing the soil by employing different ways how to do it.
What those farmers also tell me is that one of the keys to regenerating the soil is to reduce as much as possible their dependence to chemicals. So that's synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, and so on. What's wrong with using these chemicals?
Well, answer is already probably in the term. You said artificial or synthetic. So they're not natural. So nature never designed those chemicals to be in nature, and that's why if something is not natural, it sometimes can have a negative impact. In terms of, if we break down into fertilizer and pesticides area, so pesticides, they are designed to kill harmful, bacteria, microbes, or pests, and it sometimes can have an impact on beneficial as well. I know we are sometimes treating microbes that on leaves, for example, fungal disease, and just thinking, oh, mycorrhizal fungi connection is inside of soil, nothing going to happen. Sometimes it's not true. So mycorrhizal population will be affected by those chemicals. And what scientists did, they tested various chemicals and how they affect mycorrhizal fungi. So anyone who is interested in preserving mycorrhizal fungi, I would recommend to look for this list and see which chemicals are detrimental to mycorrhizae and try to avoid those chemicals. In terms of fertilizers, it's difficult to advise because I don't think we can get away from synthetic fertilizers 100% completely. Maybe in future, yes, but at the moment, I wouldn't recommend to rid of completely, because even microbes, they will need some chemicals, and if your soil is completely depleted of nutrients, you need to put them back. But if we talk about inorganic fertilizers, they come as a salt, and what happens if you add lots of salts to microbes? They got this osmotic shock. So they basically, just by adding fertilizers as a salt, will have a negative impact on microbial community. And also, in terms of mycorrhizal fungi, if you have a plant growing and you give them fertilizer, basically food that is readily available, or on another plate, you're going to have mycorrhizal fungi. For symbiosis with them, you need to pay with carbon. Question is, what plant is going to choose?
They're going to take the easy option, right?
The easier
They're going to get
option.
a bit lazy.
But then it's going to be causing another problem. But it means you have to add fertilizers again. And you have to add more and more. So you have to make sure those plants got enough nutrients. But mycorrhizal fungi bring in benefits, not just nutrients, but also they supply water. So you fed them a lot of fertilizers, but then it's event of drought, a problem.
Right.
Because there is not those relationship that can bring those water to the plant and help to save this water inside of plants. But they also protect from pests and diseases, mycorrhizal fungi. Because as I mentioned, if host is not alive, that is a problem for mycorrhizae because they will have to go dormant at least. So they will try to protect plants as much as they can. If there is a damage by pests, they will supply more nutrients to compensate this damage. But they also, mycorrhizal fungi, they act like vaccine in a way, making plants more immune to diseases. Because again, they're not interested to plant get ill. So they're trying to make them as healthy as possible. So in a way, yes, you can add more fertilizers and feed, but you will be losing those benefits that mycorrhizal fungi are
Let me
bringing.
check if I understood all of this, right? I'm going to try again. So if you feed a lot of synthetic fertilizer to a plant, it will have a lot of fertility and a lot of a boost in fertility just available there for the roots to grow. So we will use that instead of working hard to create a relationship with mycorrhizal fungi and bacteria. And so you lose on all of the other benefits that these bring, not only bringing nutrition to the plant, to the roots, but also water and also medicine and all kinds of nutrients that the plant needs to thrive. So it gets the easy nutrition from the fertilizer, but it loses on all of the other benefits that it would have gotten from creating a stronger relationship with the mycorrhizal fungi.
Exactly. And there are some more other negative impacts from being fed by fertilizers, especially if you add too much fertilizers. Plants will accumulate lots of simple nitrogen forms, and those nitrogen forms will attract pests and diseases because they're more tasty. So in a way, it's like a vicious cycle, because the more you add artificial fertilizers, the more dependent you become. And your plants, in a way, maybe seems green and lush, but in fact is not really in the best state.
Right. It's a bit like a drug. The more you use it, the more you need it, and the more you destroy your health.
That's absolutely right. That's really good.
Yeah. And when it comes to other chemicals like pesticides, for example, I mean, it does seem obvious to me that if we're spraying a chemical that is supposed to kill insects, problematic insects maybe for the farmer, but then we're also killing all other kinds of insects, including beneficial ones and predators, so the ones that will eat the insects. But what I'm wondering is, does it also have an impact on tiny critters and the microbes in the soil?
Insecticides probably not so much detrimental to tiny microbes, because as you mentioned, they're targeted for pests, for insects. But depending on chemical formulation, sometimes you think is this formulation could affect only insects, but in fact it's also affecting some other microbes that inside of soil. And if you kill those insects, they go in, they die, and those chemicals will be in soil. So that's not really good, because you're polluting soils. You added chemicals that shouldn't be there into our soil. And then if event of rain happens, and depending on the chemicals, but some chemicals are very prone to leaching, and they will be leached away into ground, surface water, contaminating those drinking water. And then again, if this water is abstracted for human consumption, it needs to be treated. And sometimes some chemicals is very difficult and very energy consuming process to remove. So in a way, you try to grow healthy plant and try to kill insect, but then you have more impacts. Plus, sometimes to synthesize those chemicals, you need lots of energy as well. So you're consuming energy, and also to make those pesticides. But also, you need more energy if those pesticides ended up in water, for example.
Another one of the key pillars of regenerative agriculture is to make sure that the soil is covered at all time, that is never let bare. But what you tend to see when driving around the countrysides in the winter months, like from November to April, so that's 5 months, almost half of the year, is bare ground everywhere. But regenerative farmers are telling me that you should never leave the soil bare and instead always have a cover on it, either dead plant materials like mulch and straw, for example, or even better, living plants with a living root in the soil. Can you tell us what's wrong with leaving the soil bare and why having plants covering it up is so much better for the soil health?
So there are many benefits, and for example, it's to prevent erosion, because those plants growing, those roots will be binding soil or keeping soils together. And when you have rain, for example, so rain, rather than heating soil and washing those soil away, it will be heating plants. And also plants, as you remember, they are host for mycorrhizal fungi. And mycorrhizal fungi, their mycelium is spread in soil and also holding particles together. And also another really, really great benefit of mycorrhizal fungi I haven't mentioned yet is about carbon. So they sequester carbon inside of their mycelium, but they also release protein, sticky glycoprotein called glomalin. And glomalin acts like a glue, so it glues particles together. So if you don't have crop growing that will be supporting this fungi will be dying, and those basically glue won't be there. And another benefit of having plants, they harbor different microbes. So if you don't have those plants growing, your biodiversity will be very, very poor, because plants can harbor different types of microbes, not just mycorrhizal fungi, but bacteria as well, for example. And I had, in my experience, I remember I was invited to give a talk about mycorrhizal fungi, and we had a field walk. And so that when I had my turn to speak about mycorrhizae, I was standing and I had a field bare behind me, and I thought that's how ironic. I was asked to talk about mycorrhizal fungi, but I'm presenting on the field without crops, without a vital host for those fungi.
Like, once again, I'm a little bit confused about then why all of these farmlands are left bare during the winters if having a plant growing in it is so beneficial to soil structure, to mycorrhizal fungi and to bacteria and to the soil fertility and health, so that when the growing season starts, the farmer can plant in a healthy soil. Why not take advantage of this opportunity?
I think that not all farmers are aware of negative impact of bare soil, and sometimes it's more difficult for them to keep soil covered all the time. For example, if they finish their harvest in August and they're planning next crop to drill in springtime, for example, so they just leave soil bare. But what they can do instead of this, they can have, for example, cover crop, because cover crop can support relationship with mycorrhizal fungi, but also will be mopping up fertilizer that were applied in the previous crop. For example, if you applied nitrogen to grow your winter wheat, but you had very dry summer, those nitrogen was not absorbed by this crop. So there will be of plenty of these nutrients left in the ground. And then you harvest it, and you didn't seed any other crops, and what's going to happen? Those fertilizer, those nitrogen will be again leached away, will be washed away in water, contaminating water. But if you have your cover crop will be, as I said, mopping for those nutrients, but also supporting mycorrhizal fungi, and mycorrhizal fungi will help as well to take up nutrients and making more carbon and gluing soil together. So basically bringing all benefits that mycorrhizal fungi bring to the soil.
And when it comes to cover crops, I guess there's a lot of options there of choosing which crops to grow. Yeah, maybe tell me a little bit more about this.
Yeah, I'm smiling at this because, again, from my own experience, I was invited to talk to some water company about they had a problem with phosphorus. Basically, they had a contamination of water with a high amount of phosphorus, and they were looking ways how to improve this issue. And obviously, they heard somewhere that mycorrhizal fungi can help with uptake of phosphorus, so it's not leached away into water. And I was giving them presentation, and then they said, oh, and I mentioned about you have to have a continuous cover, so grow crop all year round. I said, yes, we do have cover crop in our wintertime. And then I asked, okay, so what cover crops do you grow? Tell me species. And they were growing radish. And there's one thing about mycorrhizal fungi, they do colonize 80% or more than 80% of plants, but there are plants that don't make this symbiosis. So basically, any plants from Brassica family and from Chenopodiaceae family, like sugar beet, for example, they don't have this association at all. So they took a different evolutionary way, so they don't have any mycorrhizal connection at all. So they were saying they were growing mustard, and mustard obviously from Brassica family and is not associated with mycorrhizal fungi. So that's, in a way, it could be one of the reasons they had this phosphorus leaching away by growing plants and that not mycorrhizal, and therefore depleting mycorrhizal population in the ground.
I see. And what are the most beneficial plants to use as cover crops then for mycorrhizal fungi specifically? Let's focus on this first.
For mycorrhizal fungi, legume crops are really good, but it could be another way because legume crops, they fix nitrogen, so they will be rich in soil with nitrogen, but that could be a problem. This nitrogen can be leached away. Oats are very good crops as well. So linseed, if you have linseed, so that's a nice crop.
And why is that?
So mycorrhizal fungi, they do colonize roots at different level. It doesn't mean if you have, for example, if you take one root and stain and look under microscope, some plants will have fully packed with mycorrhizal fungi. So basically every single bit of this root, you can see mycorrhizal structure. And then you can say those root is 100% colonized. Some other plants, when you look at them under microscope, can have maybe 50% of colonization. Basically, there will be some patches without mycorrhiza. That's fine, because mycorrhizal fungi and plant, they regulate. So they will have an optimum amount of mycorrhizae that is needed to do the job. So if you have less mycorrhizal fungi, it doesn't mean mycorrhizal fungi is not beneficial for the crop, but that's how much you need. But if you want to breed those mycorrhizae as an inoculum in a way, you want to choose species of plants that will allow mycorrhizae to colonize 100%. So that's why when people produce mycorrhizal fungi on a commercial level, they grow crops that are 100% colonized, like clover, like maize, for example, sorghum, linseed, they are 100% colonized. Wheat, usually 50, 60, 70%. In the best case scenario, that's how much is colonized. But even those 50% is very, very beneficial. Willow, 2% only. But
okay, so each plant has a different level of colonization. So the roots get colonized by mycorrhizal fungi, and some plants have only a small percentage of those roots being colonized, but some plants are really good and they're 100% colonized by mycorrhizal fungi. So you want to choose species that have this really high level of...
If you want to breed your mycorrhizal fungi in your soil, yes.
Right. And is there other things that we might want besides mycorrhizal fungi that other types of plants could bring to the cover crops?
I think the best, what I can advise in terms of cover crops, choose a very diverse mix. Because diverse mix is all about biodiversity. If you go in nature, you will be you won't be able to see on single crop growing, monocrop growing. So that's why I would suggest have Okay, ideally I would have at least, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 crops, even more, because again, you're bringing biodiversity, and different crops will have different microorganisms. For example, certain bacteria will prefer legume plants, but the other type of bacteria maybe will prefer some cereal plants like oats. And to enrich your soil, to have this diverse community of microbes, you want to have diverse mix of cover crops.
So would you want to have the biggest diversity possible? So if you could have 100 different species because they will all bring different types of benefits to the soil, or is that not ideal because you want to kind of target specific goals in your soil?
Yes, target specific goals, but do not grow 1 or 2 species, because it's basically like having a cash crop, just one species growing. So ideally you want to have several, but again, think about your soil. If your soil is compacted, you want to have some roots, very strong roots crop. And if your soil, for example, is limited with nitrogen, you can have some legume crops.
Okay, so I got this other image in my head now where I went to the doctor to get a blood test, and it comes back and it tells me actually you're lacking zinc and iron and vitamin B12, for example. And so I will adapt my diet and maybe take some supplements specific to the issues with my current situation.
Yes.
Is that kind of what you would do with cover crops? You would analyze the situation and try to pick a mix of plants to grow that will help with fixing those specific issues?
Yes, exactly the same, because different crops have different nutrition desire. If you grow one crop, and those crops prefer, for example, sulfur. So after growing this crop, you may have some deficiency of sulfur, or, to grow this crop, you need to add this particular element. So if you have different crops in a mix, is similar. You identify which one problems you have, and you just go for certain mix.
It actually kind of links to the question I was going to ask next. It's about diversity. It's another one of the key principles of regenerative agriculture. It's to bring diversity to the farming system. And I wanted to ask the question, what is the issue with having just one type of plants growing as a monoculture, so on very vast amounts of land? And why is it better to add diversity to the farm? I guess we already kind of answered this question, but maybe you can tell us more about that.
I always say, if you need an answer, look for this answer in nature. So if something doesn't exist in nature, probably that's not the best way. So nature is very smart. It designed plants, it designed microbes the way how they are. And you can't really see monocrop growing in nature in large scale unless there are some very extreme conditions, and only one plant can adapt to these conditions. So, and if you have a monocrop, it can have some really significant issues. Like if you have a disease present, it will spread easily. You will be those monocrop will be mining for certain nutrients. So your soil become depleted of certain nutrients. And also it will be breeding just one, or several types of, not several. It also will be supporting just certain types of microbes. So rather than supporting very diverse community of microbes, because especially although mycorrhizal fungi, they don't really mind which host they have, as long as it's mycorrhizal host. I mean, like if it's not brassica, they can colonize. But with bacteria, especially with free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria, they're very host-specific. So they will prefer a certain type of plants growing. And if you have only one type of crop growing, so you might be suppressing these beneficial bacteria.
Regenerative farmers are also very keen on using animals as part of their system because it contributes to boosting soil fertility. Could you tell us why?
They produce manure, and manure is organic type of fertilizers. Organic, I mean, in terms of is more complex nutrients, and fungi especially, they do prefer more complex nutrients rather than a simple artificial fertilizers. And if you want to encourage mycorrhizal fungi, and you better supply manure or organic fertilizers. Plus, when you have cattle, for example, grazing grass crops, it will stimulate a root system, and you have a bigger root system, more actively growing, and those root system will harbor number of beneficial bacteria and fungi and some other organisms. And also some cattle can help with aeration because they will be in a way like walking on this grass.
Like the chickens scratching the floor, for example.
Yes. And again, look back into nature. In nature, animals and plants, they're all together without any synthetic fertilizers.
I guess when we
and pesticides.
We spoke about diversity, and in many ways, animals can be included in that diversity. It's not just plants; it's also the animals on the land can be a part of that.
And for me, just from my personal perspective, I was really surprised when I moved to, because I studied agriculture in my country, and in rotation, in comparison of manure is kind of no-brainer. That's how you do. But when I moved to England, I was surprised to see people don't add manure at all in their rotations because they don't have livestock. So for me, it was a big shock.
Not even manure that comes from outside of the farm, from maybe livestock operations somewhere else?
Well, I'm probably not the best person to explain, but as I understood, in England, in the United Kingdom, there is a separation. So on the west, we have more livestock farmers, and in the east, more arable farmers. So basically, they don't just have cattle, they don't have access to manure.
Can plants actually communicate with each other and with soil microbes?
Even for mycorrhizae fungi, they germinate. They're supposed to germinate when they feel presence of root exudates. So if you have spore in soil, it is in a dormant state, but then you have plant growing, and those plants will release chemicals. So fungi can feel there is a host plant nearby, I better germinate and make association. But what is also fascinating and very interesting, that plants can talk to each other in a way through network of mycorrhizae fungi. So if you imagine two plants growing next to each other, so those roots will be never connected. So roots from one plant are separate to roots of other plants. However, those plants can be connected through mycorrhizal network. So the same mycorrhizal fungus can colonize roots of one plant and a neighboring as well. And there is a paper published which describes how it works. For example, they had one plant growing and they isolated. They had a dome and they had a separate pot, but those plant was connected to another plant through hyphal network. So basically, if they wanted to talk each other, only through mycorrhizae. So what the scientists did, they introduced aphids, pests, to one plant and covered with a dome. So the other plant, they had their defensive mechanism upregulated as well, although there was no aphids present. So basically, a plant that had aphids somehow signaled to another plant through mycorrhizal network saying, you better upregulate your defense because aphids are coming and be ready for the attack. So that's what plants did.
Well, that's incredible.
It is incredible. It's just different chemicals that probably one plant was sending to another one.
My first understanding of root exudates, of the chemicals that were released by the plants, was it's just this one thing. It's one mass of liquid carbon or whatever it's sending down in the soil. But it's not. It's what, hundreds, thousands of different types of chemicals it can generate?
Yes.
So these thousands of chemicals, they could kind of be associated with some kind of language, because depending on which chemicals they would choose to send in the soil, then the reaction of the microbes or the reaction of other plants around them will be different. So it feels like communication to me, like intelligent communication between plants and microbes.
No, it certainly is. And scientists, they're trying to figure it out what exactly chemicals attract which microbes.
Imagine that an important policymaker is calling you tomorrow to ask for your opinion on what to do in order to support soil health in general, but mycorrhizal fungi as well. And you have to give him one piece of advice. Which one would it be?
Continuous cover. Because without continuous crop cover, because without crop, there is no mycorrhizal fungi. They're dependent on crop. If you don't have crop growing, your mycorrhizae struggle.
So it should support cover crops. So it should maybe help funding farmers to plant cover crops, or make it a legal necessity that your soil should be covered at all time with a cover crop, something like that.
Something like that. Cover crop are important if you have a spring crop in your rotation. And diverse rotation is also really useful and should be implemented, rather than I had next door field and I can predict what they will be growing, because their rotation was wheat, rape, wheat, rape.
Mm-hmm.
And that shouldn't be like this.
Thank you so much for your time and your valuable insight. It's been a real pleasure. I hope that we'll get to do this again.
Thank you for inviting. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure.